Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Speed Chess Championship 2024. In this video, I'll be showing you games from the one and only legendary Hans Niemann. Hans Niemann has been unstoppable, sweeping through the division like anything. This man is on his peak right now and is rated 27 in the world as of 1st of August 2024. He's rated 2711 and has been beating talented grandmasters like Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Antoine David. In this video, I'll be showing you 5 games that Hans Niemann played on 31st of July 2024 yesterday, and those games were absolutely breathtaking. So without further ado, let's get right into the video. So the first game I'm going to show you is Hans Niemann versus Antoine David, a talented grandmaster rated 33,040 on chess.com and number 60 in the world. In this game, Hans has the white pieces, and Hans plays the advanced Caro-Kann, in which he puts both of his knights on these squares, controlling this and reinforcing his center like this. David and then Hans in this position plays a4, a very edgy move, to which David responds with a5. Now this square is really weak if this pawn ever moves, and in this game exactly that happens. After some moves, both players have castled, and David decides to play a very committal move, c5, attacking the integrity of Hans' center, which Hans defends. But now this square is up for grabs for this bishop or this knight maybe in the future. Hans does exactly that and plops his bishop here, and David goes for counterplay and plops his knight over here, which is a really strong square for his knight. We have a trade in the center, and Hans starts to bring his knight and fighting for the square c5. In this position, Hans plays bishop here, reinforcing his center and encouraging black to take, because after black takes, Hans has this really powerful cluster of pawns which helps to defend against his king and reinforce his center, which will make it really hard. So David has to go for this pawn break. David plops his knight here and Hans takes this file. David starts to fight for this file, and Hans takes his rook immediately and trades the powerful bishop, which was an absolute demon on that square. Hans now starts attacking and putting pressure on this weak pawn, which is only defended by the king, and now David has to go on the defense and plays this. And in this position, Hans Niemann uncorks a brilliant move, bishop e8. This bishop is immortal, untakeable. If black takes this bishop, Hans Niemann bulldozes this, and then the king has to move and then takes the rook, and then black can resign. Instead, black sacrifices his own bishop. Now, believe it or not, in this position, the best move was actually to remove... Wait a second, I'm sorry. In this position, the best move for black was to actually bring the knight back and allow the bishop to check, because after this, believe it or not, this king is absolutely safe. These pawns prevent the queen from infiltrating, and the rook applies pressure by pinning this bishop, which the black can come and exploit. Instead, we get bishop here, sacrificing back the bishop. Hans takes, and then David takes, and it's a trade. And Hans goes temporarily a pawn up by taking here, and Hans has nasty intentions because the dark squares near black king are really weak. David comes here to defend against any queen infiltration using this move, and that's exactly what happens. The pawn defends. Hans Niemann tries to reroute this knight here or reinforce this so that he can break in the center later. David comes and he wants to trade the queens so that pressure can be relinquished, and later he can take this pawn and maybe head for a draw or even push for a win. In this position, Hans backs off because Hans is playing for a win. David plays here to prevent the queen from getting in. Hans Niemann tries to break in the center. Now in this position, David had an opportunity, but he retreated back. The best move in this position was the absolute absurd e5, getting an explosion in the center of the board, because if white takes, black takes back, and black can, although white can give this check here and push the king back, black is absolutely fine, because there is no easy way to attack and utilize this, because this pawn, believe it or not, is not an asset, or it is a liability which black can come and win later in the game using his knight and rook, maybe after trading this knight. Instead of all of this, we get knight back. Hans Niemann also brings his knight here, maybe to do this. In this position, black takes, Hans takes back, and black plays here, pressuring this pawn. And Hans Niemann goes here, and in this position, black can take this pawn, but instead black decides to trade the knights. Hans Niemann gives this check, and black's king moves here. In this position, white is attacking black ruthlessly, and white plays the move rook f4 with the clear idea of going here and checkmating black. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in this position makes a blunder and plays rook c8, thinking that after here he can just go here and then escape. But Hans Niemann, after this and eating a few checks, confidently walks his king. And after this move, Maxime thought that he was out of trouble, but the troubles just began. Hans Niemann finds the move queen f6, and now all of these squares are covered, and rook h8 is unstoppable. You can go here, rook h8 is mate. You can go here, rook h8 is mate. You cannot stop checkmate. All you can do is sacrifice all of your pieces, and then inevitably get checkmated. And in this position, David Antoine resigns the game, and Hans Niemann grabs this victory. The next game, now we have 4 games, all Hans Niemann versus Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. These guys had an absolutely astonishing battle yesterday in the Speed Chess Championship, and these are 4 of the games in which Hans puts an absolute masterclass. What a break. The first game, Maxime and Hans decide to play a Berlin. In this, at this level, the Berlin is basically a draw offer, and white actually castles, inviting the Berlin. And in this position, both players go to a Berlin endgame after trading all of their pieces. This position has been played thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of times by top level grandmasters on an everyday basis. Black decides to go here and starts pushing p down the board to attack this king. White reroutes the knight here, maybe to bring the knight here to start to poke at these pawns and defend the king. These players play a few moves, and it's clear that this pawn is very strong, and black will try to win this pawn while white will try to defend this and maybe trade some pieces so that he can have an endgame. Maxime brings his knight here to try to defend this pawn, and Hans Niemann finds the rook lift, after which he can go and start poking on these pawns. He can go here, pinning this knight and putting pressure on this rook and stuff like that. Maxime retreats his knight because he wants none of that, and Hans Niemann plays this move, restricting the mobility of this bishop, preventing the bishop from coming here or here in the future, or even trying to trade. Maxime brings his rook here with the idea to double up and defend this pawn, or even attack this in case this rook ever moves, or even win this right now if Hans Niemann does not defend it. Hans Niemann plays this move, getting a powerful dark squared pawn structure and ensuring that this bishop has long-term mobility. Instead of taking this pawn, which Maxime should have probably done, Maxime backs off with the knight. This move looks really, really ugly because it blocks the rook, and where is the knight going? It's not clear. Hans Niemann plays this move, which was his idea all along. Now this bishop is an absolute demon and is pressuring this whole diagonal and can be used for attacks later in the game. Maxime brings his rook here and counter-attacks this pawn, and black immediately retreats to defend it. This pawn, the king goes forward now to win this pawn, which Maxime is trying his best to defend, but this pawn will fall inevitably if Hans succeeds to blockade this square and win this pawn using the bishop and the rook here. Hans Niemann takes the open file and Maxime comes here with his knight, but it is not clear where the knight wants to go because the knight can't go here, 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 and it's not really clear what the knight is doing. Maybe the knight is defending against any pawn pushes. Maybe Maxime has his own idea of pushing this pawn forward. Hans Niemann backs with the rook, and now Maxime shows his idea. He plops his knight here, utilizing a tactic. The tactic is that if Hans Niemann takes in this position, black will play this check using this pawn, and it is the fact that it's defended, and black has to back off, after which this fork is possible, and now Maxime is winning this game. So in this position, after knight here, Hans Niemann does not take and instead plays the best move, bringing his rook to attack the knight, and now the knight has to move back. This was a one-mover gamble by Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and a trap on which Hans Niemann does not fall for, and now Hans Niemann is winning after the move g5, because now all these pieces are just setting targets for these pawns, and now the pawns can start rolling down the board. The rook goes there to counter-attack this pawn, and Hans Niemann plays this move and building an impenetrable fortress. Now this rook is offside, and all white can do is come here and go back, and this is a lot of waste of time. Maxime plays this to blockade and prevent white from advancing his pawns and preventing this knight to be attacked and being a target. Hans Niemann plays f5 with a clear idea of going g4 and starting an attack here. Maxime comes back with the knight now because these pawns are weak. Before, in this position, these pawns were a strong chain, but now these pawns are weak, and Maxime targets these. Now if Hans pushes, Maxime can simply take this pawn because the rook from there can help. So in this position, Hans Niemann defends this pawn by going rook here, and now Maxime Vachier-Lagrave goes for counterplay, plopping his knight in the center of the board, well defended, and now the knight can go and target these pieces. Hans immediately draws back with the rook to prevent his rook from getting taken, and now Vachier-Lagrave has tunnel vision and decides to go in with the knight, whereas it's not clear what the knight is doing here. The knight is offside. Hans Niemann correctly spots this bishop trade, which is a crucial move, because if this bishop trade was not done, so white could have taken with the knight, and after king takes or rook takes, this move would have been lethal, and this pawn push would have been the end of Hans Niemann. But Hans Niemann finds the move bishop to g7, trading this bishop, and now it's not really clear what Vachier-Lagrave is doing or how he will attack. Hans Niemann goes to the back rank and starts pressuring these pawns, and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave doubles up. But the problem with this is that there's a pawn here which the king is using to shield itself, and there's not much that in this position white can do. Hans Niemann pushes forward with the move g4, ripping open the defenses of the king, and he takes with the rook to pressure this pawn. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave tries to defend with the move g3, but in this position, instead of taking this pawn and simply trading, Hans Niemann puts pressure on the pinned piece, goes f4, pressuring this pawn even more. And now, after this, defending the knight against any intrusions, Hans Niemann simply trades the rooks, because now Hans Niemann does not need to take these pawns to win the game, because after takes, Hans Niemann simply winning a pawn here, and after this takes, Hans Niemann is up 2 pawns. And in this position, after playing 2 or 3 more moves, Vishelogrov is going to lose this pawn too and be 3 pawns down. And in this position, Maxime resigns the game, handing Hans another victory. After this, we get another game with the same opening, the Berlin endgame. But in this game, we bring all of our pieces, trade our knights, have the same thing, trade our bishops. So it's now 2 rooks and a bishop versus 2 rooks and a bishop. And all of the pieces get traded, and we are left with a bishop versus rook end game. And in this end game, it's not really clear who's better. Hans has this ugly double pawn, and Maxime has a king side majority, but these pawns are really powerful. And if this bishop ever takes, Hans has an initiative and active rook with the move rook d2, eating all of these pawns and putting pressure. And that's exactly what happens. Maxime goes there to defend his king against any future checks. Hans goes here, bishop e6 to pressure that pawn, and in case black ever takes that. White defends his pawn by pushing. Hans centralizes his rook, maybe to go here, and in this position, Maxime Vishelogrov takes the pawn. Hans tries to trap the bishop, but the bishop goes back. So Hans goes here to counterattack that pawn. The bishop takes. Hans takes this pawn first, and after takes, White has to defend this bishop, and White goes here. Now in this position, Maxime is temporarily a pawn up, but Hans will quickly go here and win this pawn with ease. That's exactly what happens. White gives a check. Hans Niemann goes to g6 with his king to defend both of these pawns, and in this position, White goes here, rook f3, with the clear idea of going here, attacking this pawn because the bishop is already attacking, and winning this pawn in case Hans takes. Now Hans goes the critical h4, a very, very good move in order to stop any shenanigans from here. Now Maxime goes here to win this pawn and re-enable this check to win that pawn. Now there are 2 threats, and how does Hans defend against these? Hans plays the genius bishop f4, the genius bishop d5, bishop d5. This move is really, really sneaky because this now attacks this pawn, and in case Hans takes here or takes this pawn, this is being pressured and can be taken if the rook relinquishes the defense. So the rook has to go here and defend this pawn, and that's exactly what happened. And in this position, Hans Niemann goes king f5, and now White can take another free pawn and be 2 pawns up, and taking this pawn is the right move. Now you can take the pawn with the rook, or you can take the pawn with the bishop, and only one of these moves win for White, and the other one is a big blunder. And in this position, Maxime Vishelogrov blunders. He takes with the bishop, and this is a massive blunder to the absolutely brilliant bishop f3. A brilliancy by Hans Niemann. You cannot take with the pawn because your king falls, and in this position, the rook is trapped. The rook cannot continue and defend this pawn anymore. If the rook goes here, the king takes. If the rook goes here, king takes. If the rook goes here, pawn takes. So the rook has to go here and disable the defense of this pawn. And if that happens, if the rook does not move, the bishop takes, and this is a absolutely winning endgame for black. But if the rook goes here and takes another free pawn, in this position, Maxime Vishelogrov is up 3 pawns, but black is winning because of the famous windmill tactic. In this position, Hans Niemann will take this pawn, and Maxime only has 1 square, after which this is a windmill and all of the pieces of White fall. So in this position, Maxim Vassilogrov plays king here and resigns the game. An absolutely brilliant move by Hans Niemann. It was an equal game. Hans Niemann was down 2 pawns, but he found the brilliant move, bishop f3. Instead, Maxim had to take with the rook, and now the rook can defend this pawn, and this will likely be a draw because of the fact that this pawn will fall, and after simplification only there will be a rook and a pawn versus a rook, which is a theoretical draw. We move to the next game, in which Hans Niemann mixes it up with an English opening, and an English with the bishop fianchettoed here, Catalan style. Black plays d5, and after takes, queen takes, both players develop their knights, and Hans fianchettos his bishop. His idea is simple. He's gonna castle, he's gonna go here, fianchetto this bishop, and then he's gonna start to chip away on the center of the board. And that's exactly what Hans Niemann does. Both players castle. Hans goes here to control these two squares. Another water break. These games are absolutely amazing. So Maxim goes here, reinforcing this pawn, and maybe ideas to go here in the future. Hans goes rook c1, so that when the knight moves later, there's pressure on this file. Maxim goes bishop here to maybe go retreat back, protect his king later, pressure this square, or also enable this. Hans Niemann goes back with his knight to enable the scope of his bishop and control this square. Stop this, or maybe go here with the knight himself. Maxim goes queen up, and Hans goes rook e1, preparing the move maybe here. Now Maxim Vassilogrov shows the idea behind this move. This move was to form a battery with the bishop and play this, so that after this and queen takes, Maxim can have an initiative with the move knight here, or maybe start a pawn avalanche and attack Hans Niemann. But Hans Niemann retreats back with the bishop, giving black control of this, but the squares, light squares of white are safe, and this was a really good move because white controls this whole diagonal, and in any case, if the knight ever moves, white will take with the bishop and threaten the rook and have good ideas to attack over here. So Maxim goes here, so that to enable the movement of his knight, so that this pawn is defended all later. Hans Niemann centralizes his knight, goes here, and Maxim drops back with his knight. Maybe ideas to go here or here to defend and attack. Now Hans Niemann puts his knights in the center and builds a good correlation of knights, pressuring this bishop and forcing a reaction of black. Black in this position trades these knights, and in this position Hans Niemann takes with the pawn, which is a good move, but taking with the bishop would have been better because of the fact that now your bishop is stuck and you have doubled pawns. But Hans Niemann gets the open file, which he can later utilize, and now this bishop is actually pinned, because if this bishop ever moves, Hans Niemann simply takes the queen. In this position, Maxim plays knight here, looking for this square, because this square is looking good for the knight. So Hans Niemann now takes this bishop because he has now formed a pawn weakness, and now Hans Niemann starts to target with this weakness with this and this, and Maxim defends. Now this weakness cannot really be targeted, because the only other way you can attack this is by playing bishop here, and if the bishop ever leaves the defense of this square, the knight comes in and starts menacing the white position. So now Maxim centralizes this rook too, and in this position Hans plays this move to defend this pawn, and maybe ideas to go here, attack and defend. Now Maxim steps away from the spin and goes here, maybe to play d5 himself. Hans Niemann now rook lifts rook to c2, and now starts to double up on this file, because he has now changed his plan, because after realizing this pawn cannot fall, now Hans Niemann will start to pressure on this file, and that's exactly what happens. Maxim Vassilogrov puts his king over here because he doesn't really know what to do. Now Maxime rotates his queen over here, and now Maxime has nasty intentions for the king over here. This bishop is now a target because it's not really doing anything, and Maxime can start rolling with the pawns. He has a good bishop pressuring here, and now Hans plays the move e3, which is a really good move because this move prevents the knight from coming here and ever targeting the bishop in the future. So in this position, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave lashes out with the move f5, creating counterplay, and this is really good move. In this position, Hans Niemann plays rook c4 in order to take like this, and now Vachier-Lagrave will start his own attack. He rotates his rook over here, and now white does not have enough time to win this pawn, because by the time you win this pawn, your king absolutely gets demolished. So in this position, Hans Niemann plays the move b4 with the clear intention of playing b5 and removing this knight, and now black has an opportunity. The best move in this position for black is to come in with the move f4, because f4, the idea behind f4 is to take, and then white can't take back because of this pin, and if white takes with the queen, white loses the queen, and this pawn cannot take back because of the pin, and black is knocking on the door of the white king and attacking him, and this is slightly better for white. But instead, Maxime hesitates and plays the move rook to d6, hesitating and defending the rook, and this is the last chance. This was the last chance for Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, as now Hans Niemann plays b5 and the knight has to go back, and now Hans Niemann comes in. First he takes this pawn to prevent any attacks over here, because Vachier-Lagrave has now lost the opportunity to do that. Vachier-Lagrave takes back with the bishop, which is a really bad move, because now his knight can be targeted by the rook, and the knight doesn't really have any useful squares to go because all of these squares are jumbled. Instead, he should have taken with the bishop or even the rook to start pressuring this bishop, or the knight maybe to attack later. Sacrificial idea is looming, but instead Vachier-Lagrave takes back with the bishop, and this is the final nail in the coffin, as Hans Niemann does not waste the opportunity and plays rook to c7, pressuring these pawns, hitting the knight. Now with the last ditch effort, Vachier-Lagrave plays the move rook d7 himself to trade the rooks, but the rook is defended and Hans Niemann is in no hurry. He takes the free pawn on b7, and now Maxime makes another bad move by putting his queen in the line of sight of the rook. Now the queen should not be playing like this, because the rooks are really powerful and the queen shouldn't be the piece that is attacking. Instead, Vachier-Lagrave should have moved this rook over here to prepare to defend against, instead of moving the queen, because now the queen is pinned after the knight or the rook moves, and that's exactly what happens. Hans Niemann applies pressure on this pawn. Now Vachier-Lagrave is really passive and has to go rook d8 to defend the pawn, and now Hans simply retreats back with the bishop, making room for his queen, and then his idea is to push p down the board and promote. In this position, Vachier-Lagrave attacks the pawn. Hans Niemann does not care. He swoops in with the queen. Now Vachier-Lagrave tries to generate counterplay by getting Hans to take back with the queen, so that after that the knight can maybe come in here, or maybe he can start a pawn avalanche. But Hans Niemann shuts the door on Vachier-Lagrave's face by playing the move e4. Now the bishop has to go or take the pawn, and take the pawn he does, and after that Hans Niemann simply takes the pawn, and there is too much pressure over here. Vachier-Lagrave defends his rook by going here, and Hans Niemann plays the move b6 with the clear idea of promotion. Vachier-Lagrave plays the move knight to g6 to trade the pieces of Hans Niemann, but now it is too little too late, as Hans Niemann plays the brilliant move bishop b6, giving up the bishop. The bishop cannot really be taken because Vachier-Lagrave put the queen here, and the queen is pinned, which is why it was a terrible decision to put the queen over here. And in this position, Vachier-Lagrave plays queen over here. Hans Niemann takes with the rook, and now the queen simply drops back, and now Hans Niemann will push p down the board. He'll put his rook behind, push p, promote, and checkmate. In this position, Vachier-Lagrave goes and makes a last ditch effort and goes rook to f7, piling pressure on this pawn and maybe looking for nasty intention for the king. But Hans Niemann simply plays queen e3, and Maxim Vasilogrov is reduced to 8 squares. All of his pieces are on 8 squares. He has a queen, a rook, a bishop, a knight, 3 pawns, a king. All of these pieces reduced to one corner of the board, and he resigns the game because Hans Niemann will simply push p down the board, promote, and there is nothing that Vasilogrov can do to stop it. If he comes back with the knight, Hans simply chops it down. He cannot come back with the bishop. The rook chops, and Vasilogrov can't move a single piece, resigns the game, and now Hans Niemann wins another victory. Absolute demolishment by Hans Niemann, sweeping through the division. Now we have the last game played between Hans and yet again Maxim Vasilogrov. These guys putting an absolute show of chess. Then this game is actually a bullet game. All of the rest were blitz game, 5 minutes and 3 minute games with increment. This is also bullet with 1 second increment. But I decided to show this game because of how good this was. So in this game, there is a Sicilian in which both players trade these pieces. Hans going for the passive structure instead of going here and trading here and putting the knight in the center. He's putting all of his pawns on the light squares because he has traded his light squared bishop, and Maxime playing on the dark squares because this whole diagonal looks juicy over here. Open diagonal, starts to put his bishop over here, and that's exactly what happens. Hans Niemann plays this to defend and blunten this in bishop and the influence and controlling this square in the center of the board, and preparing the move d4, which he immediately plays, striking back in the center. Now Hans Niemann has a good center, 2 pawns in the center controlling these squares, a knight here, and he's gonna put a knight here shortly. And he has the dream structure of every beginner chess player. In this position, black castles, and white plays the move queen e2, preparing nasty intentions on this file over here, and black fails to realize this, plays the move a6 to prevent knight jumps, but that is a bad move and a mistake because Hans Niemann plays the move e5, capitalizing on this diagonal, and black should in this position have really played the move why is the board glitching, bro? This move, so that after takes, the center is closed and white cannot attack, but that doesn't happen. Hans Niemann marches down the center of the board and comes in with this pawn, and now this is the position where all of black's pieces are jumbled up at the back rank. Every single one of black's pieces is on the first and the second rank. The rooks aren't really doing anything, pressuring the knights. All of the pawns cannot exceed the third rank, and the king is really vulnerable. The knight swoops in, and Hans is simply threatening the knight f7, which cannot be stopped. And now Vasilogrov has to give up his rook, but it is not over because it is a bullet game after all. After this, the players, and in this position, Vasilogrov tries to trade the queen, which is not a good decision because if you're down material, you should not be trading your queens. Hans Niemann blunders in this position and takes the free pawn. And now 3 things attack this pawn, which is only defended by this king. And Vasilogrov had to be brave and take this pawn with the knight. He could also take with the bishop, but the best move was to take with the knight. Vasilogrov hesitates, plays the move queen f5, and this was the last opportunity that Hans Niemann gave him, as Hans comes back with the bishop and offers a trade, after which the rook would be activated. So Vasilogrov does not trade, instead counterattacks this pawn. Hans Niemann plays h3, booting the knight back, and the bishop goes back here, maybe to threaten checkmate, but Vasilogrov goes here, protecting this diagonal with his bishop. Vasilogrov plays queen here, trying to trade the queen yet again, Hans Niemann tries to trade the queen again because he's up material and he wants to trade the queens, and Vasilogrov drops back. He says no. Hans Niemann goes back with his queen, pressuring this pawn, and Vasilogrov starts to bring his knights here. He plays knight here, and then Hans Niemann continues with the plan to pressure this pawn over here. Vishilogrov tries to generate counterplay by pushing the pawns in front of his king. This is a weakening and yet risky decision, but this is the only thing that Vishilogrov has going for him in this position. Hans centralizes his other rook because there is simply no threat. You can't push this pawn because of the blockade of this bishop. Vishilogrov tries to bring the king here to protect these pawns. Hans centralizes his knight, attacks the rook. Vishilogrov goes and attacks the queen. He's trying his best to generate counterplay, but Hans simply is too accurate. He moves the queen away. Hans Niemann gets pinned. He moves out of the pin. Excellent chess by Hans Niemann. Vishilogrov goes here, protecting the rook, and now Vishilogrov is starting to get dangerous, generating counterplay by pushing all of his pieces, and now Vishilogrov's pieces are coming alive, but Hans Niemann, quick with it, trades down his knight and will start to trade all of Vishilogrov's pieces. Vishilogrov has to be quick. He takes with this pawn, splitting his pawns, generating 3 pawn islands, but in doing so, he has the open file and can attack later. Hans brings back his bishop with the simple idea to trade, and Hans Niemann and Maxime drops back with the knight. Hans Niemann goes here, protecting his pawn, and Black comes in with the knight to attack the queen and generate counterplay over here. And in this position, White plays the only move, queen here, to maintain a good advantage. And in this position, Black goes here, trying his best to attack, but there's nothing that Black can do because Hans Niemann simply pushes this pawn, forming this, but this pawn is in the process now really weak, and Hans Niemann has to be careful because this pawn is also pinned, meaning that this pawn is right now is undefended, and this pawn is only defended by the queen, not really by this pawn because it is pinned. Maxime Vishilogrov goes here to take this pawn, seizing the opportunity, but Hans Niemann simply goes king here. Now this pawn is not pinned, hence it can take back. Vishilogrov retreats back with the knight with the idea to come here, and now because the dark squares of White are weak, to exploit these squares, Vishilogrov goes here to eat some pawns. Hans Niemann defends, and now the critical move after taking this pawn, Hans Niemann is winning, but Hans Niemann is totally dominating, but Black starts to generate counterplay. He goes and takes this pawn, and after queen here, Black takes this pawn, and now Vishilogrov is back in the game because of the fact that this pawn is now under attack, and so is the queen. So in this position, White has to sacrifice his queen. And although this is a brilliant move, this is really counterintuitive, and Hans Niemann had allowed Vishilogrov in the game. And although the computer gives a +2 advantage, if I turn off the engine, it is really difficult because Black has 2 pieces and a queen, while White has 2 rooks and a bishop. And the only reason this position is winning for White is because of this pin and the fact that White will win this knight over here. That's exactly what happens. White retreats, putting pressure, and Black has to give this knight up. Instead, Black goes here, tries to attack the rook, and Hans Niemann takes the knight. And immediately after this, Black blunders. Black plays the move Queen f7. Black had to get off this diagonal, and Hans Niemann simply pins the queen to the king. And in this position, Maxime Vishilogrov resigns the game, handing Hans Niemann a victory. Hans almost slipped up in this game, and this was really dangerous. And had Hans not sacrificed his queen and played any other move, Vishilogrov would have had an advantage. Just for demonstration, this is the second best move of the engine, and it's absolutely winning for Black. This was the only move to sacrifice the queen, and this position wasn't easy, but luckily for Hans Niemann, he found the defensive resource. Bishop here attacking this, and Vishilogrov, instead of playing the best move, which was queen here, stepping off the pin and letting go of this knight, he goes here, tries to generate counterplay, and gets obliterated by Hans Niemann, and Hans Niemann wins yet another game. So in this video, I hope you enjoyed absolute domination of Hans Niemann in the Speed Chess Championship. He's sweeping through the division, and in case I see any more interesting games, I'll be sure to make a video about it and share it with you guys. So all of you guys smash that subscribe button, and see you guys in the next video. I hope you're drinking enough water. I hope you guys are doing well. I hope you guys have an amazing day. Know that you're valuable. Bad days happen. Just sleep it out. See you. Peace.